Hello and welcome to Nex-Tech Pitmaster. I'm Kelly Wirtz, Four Legs Up Barbecue, Great Bend, Kansas. Thanks for watching all of our other videos. Today we're going to talk about brines, brine basics, and in this video we're going to talk about the basics of meat brines. I want you to understand how and why brine works so you can be successful in your own brining efforts with the least amount of work. Because let's face it, we're all busy. What we're going to cover today is what happens when meat cooks, why an unbrined meat is dry, the advantages of brining, how to make a brine, and how to brine any appropriate meat. First, let's talk about what happens when meat cooks so you can get a little bit better understanding of why we want to brine and why it actually works. Meat is made up mostly of proteins and water. When heat is applied to the meat proteins, the muscle fibers contract, which forces the contained water in the voids between the muscles out of the body of the meat, making for a drier product. In other words, think of a sponge. If you've got a meat protein here, like a brisket, a pork loin, or something like that, when you apply heat to it, when you put it in the grill or put it in the oven, even on the skillet on the stove, the heat makes the meat fibers contract, which forces the water out of the voids between the meat fibers, just like this. The more you heat it, the more the muscle fibers contract and the more moisture you lose. If you're cooking meat to anything less than a medium degree of doneness, around 150 degrees internal temperature in that meat, the muscle fibers will not contract as much, so they retain quite a little bit of moisture. That's why when you cook a steak or a prime rib to a rare or a medium rare, it'll have much more moisture in the final product than beef cooked to a medium or a well done. Cooking over 150 degrees internal temperature causes those meat fibers to contract much more, forcing more moisture out of the meat. And generally, even at internal temperatures over 170 degrees, almost all of that moisture is forced out of the meat. There are instances, though, where meat proteins can seem moist when cooked to internal temperatures over 170, such as a brisket or a pork butt or ribs or anything that we would typically barbecue. But that really has more to do with collagen contained within the meat than the moisture, which is a whole other topic for a whole other video. Meats high in initial moisture and fat, such as a beef ribeye or even a pork butt, don't benefit as much from brining because of their higher moisture content and fat content that they initially have to start with. That higher moisture and fat content tend to carry over into the cooked product if you cook them correctly. Poultry, on the other hand, is another great candidate for brining because of the lower initial moisture content in the meat and lower fat content. And also because poultry we generally cook to that higher internal temperatures, 160, 65 degrees, even up to chicken thighs, 180, 85 degrees. Fish and pork are other great candidates for brining as well, mostly because of their lower initial moisture and fat content. But one big caution, even though you've brined a meat product, you can still overcook it and it will still be dry. A chicken or a turkey breast cooked over 170 degrees may still be dry, even though you brined it, because you've cooked it so much, you've contracted those muscle fibers so much, we've squeezed all the moisture, a bunch of the moisture out of it. So why do we brine the bird in the first place? With what we've already learned, it's mostly for moisture retention. By far, that's the biggest reason to brine, is to help retain moisture in those lean proteins, such as poultry, some pork cuts, fish, when cooked to those higher temperatures. Number two would be flavor. Because we're adding moisture to the meat, we can also add flavors to that brine solution that will in turn add flavor to the meat itself. Texture is the third one. By adding moisture, we can improve the texture of the final cooked product because now it's a more moist piece of meat instead of that dry, hard piece of meat that you sometimes get. So how does brining work in the first place? Well, here's the basics. A basic brine is a solution of 5 to 10% salt dissolved in liquid. Or in other words, look at it this way, a basic brine recipe starts out with 1 cup of kosher salt to 1 gallon of liquid. And we'll get to more on recipes here towards the end of the video. But let's take a little detour here and talk about salt for just a little bit, because the type of salt you use does make a difference. We said on the to start with here that it's 1 cup of kosher salt to 1 gallon of liquid for that basic brine recipe. It does make a difference there which salt we're going to use. All salt, whether you're talking about kosher salt or just plain old table salt, is 97.5% sodium. Now that also works for sea salt. You know, there's a myriad of different salts out there you can get anymore. But it's all basically 97.5% sodium. But when you measure it with a measuring cup, like we've got here, the density or the grain size of the salt will affect the amount of actual salt, that 97.5% sodium, that you're going to get. So if we look here real close, as we pour this kosher salt out, you can see that the grain size on that kosher salt is a whole lot bigger than the grain size of this table salt we've got. So when we volumetrically measure that with a measuring cup, we'll actually get less salt in the measuring cup with the kosher salt than we will with the table salt. That's why it does make a big difference depending on what salt you're going to use. If you do not have kosher salt at home when you get ready to make your brine, if you're going to go off that 1 cup of kosher salt per gallon of liquid recipe, and all you've got is table salt, you'll need to only use 2/3 of a cup of the table salt versus the 1 cup of kosher salt. So that's why we worry about that salt content. If you use that full 1 cup of table salt, more than likely the product that you brined with that is going to be way too salty for you. To move on past the salt then, when a meat protein is placed in a salt solution, the brine that we've made up, the moisture in the meat is at a much lower salt solution than the brine. If you remember your high school chemistry, solutions will go into equilibrium. And that's kind of what our little demonstration here is going to show. We've just got some water, a little food coloring. As you drip that food coloring in there, and what's happening is over time that food coloring is going to go into equilibrium in the water. We can speed that up with the food coloring by stirring it, and you notice that food coloring is now dispersing out, so it will soon become equilibrium in that whole solution. Okay, that's really what we're trying to do with the brine. We're going to move the salt solution from the outside in the brine so it becomes in equilibrium inside our chicken, our turkey, or whatever else it is that we're going to put in that solution. So there's equal amounts of salt, which is what we're going after, and the outside going to the inside of our meat product. Okay? So after we get done brining, there's going to be a higher concentration of salt inside the meat protein. That's going to help us retain moisture because salt attracts moisture and it holds it tighter in the muscle fibers than it did before. So again, when those muscle fibers contract, like we did with the sponge during cooking, more of the moisture is going to be retained in that meat product when we're done. So how long does brining take? Well, it depends on how big of a meat you're going to talk about in the first place. To brine, you will need to soak a chunk of meat in that brine solution. The time needed to be effective basically depends on the size of the meat that we're talking about. The bigger the chunk of meat, the longer it's going to take. Here are a few rules of thumb for you to go by. If you've got a whole turkey, we're looking at 24 to 48 hours to get that brining process complete. If we're looking at, say, like a whole chicken, in that 4 to 5 pound range, 12 to 24 hours. Chicken thighs, turkey parts, legs, thighs, whatever it is, 4 to 12 hours. But remember that a chicken breast is much smaller than a turkey leg, so you're going to have to adjust accordingly. Whole pork loins, you're talking 12 to 24 hours. You can do pork chops, single serving pork chops in an afternoon, 4 to 8 hours. But just because we've reached the end of that brining process doesn't mean you're ready to cook yet, because you're going to have to rest that bird when you're done. After you've removed the meat from the brine, rest it in the fridge for at least 1/4. That's 1/4 of the time that it was in the brine. This will allow the brine and the meat to equalize all over in the bird or in the meat, just like when you rest a piece of meat when it comes off the grill. For example, if you've got a brine turkey in the brine solution for 48 hours, let it rest out of the brine in the refrigerator, wrapped up in a plastic bag so it doesn't rip all over the place. Let it rest for another 12 hours before you put it in the cooker. There again, that will help the whole thing become a lot more uniform and get our brine equally distributed all over the bird. Okay, so you forgot to thaw the turkey. You got busy. Yeah, I'm guilty of it too. Got busy at work and didn't get the turkey out of the freezer in time to let it set for 2 or 3 or 4 days before you need to cook it. Well, don't worry, we can fix that. Just make a smaller batch of brine and inject liberal amounts into the meat, then let it rest for 12 to 24 hours before cooking for all that solution to come into equilibrium in the meat itself. Use whatever injector you've got in the kitchen gadget aisle in your favorite department store. You can buy injectors like this. These kind of injectors also come with a lot of the pre-made injections that you can buy in the grocery stores. They got them shrink wrapped right on the side of the bottles. If you go to your local hardware or farm store, a lot of times you can get veterinary needles, syringes with the needles. Don't worry, they're sanitary. They work great for this kind of thing. You can get small ones, you can get big ones, whatever size you want, whatever you want to deal with. Or you can order some of the big dogs like this one off of the internet. This is actually a regular meat injector that we use for a lot of our stuff. No matter what you want to use, these are about 50 bucks a pop. You know, you're going to spend $3 or $4 for one of these. One of these, you're going to spend 99 cents on it. And you get done with it, throw it away, and you don't have to worry about cleaning them up. If you are going to inject your brine directly into the meat, you might want to use a little bit lower salt concentration in your brine. Because with the injection, we have a tendency to put a little bit more brine in it than what we would get if we were just soaking. So you basically use no more than about 6 ounces of salt per gallon of liquid if you're going to inject. And one caution, never, 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 never thaw your turkey on the kitchen counter, this counter, any other counter whatsoever. Thaw the thing in the fridge, which takes about a week to thaw out completely. Or, again, if you're like me and you didn't think about it quite soon enough, you got busy, do a quick thaw by throwing that frozen fowl in a cooler, anything like this. You get your pop cooler sitting out there. You know, if you got one like this or whatever it is, clean the inside of it out, throw that frozen fowl right in the cooler, run cold water on top of it, put the lid back on it, and just let it set for about a day, maybe up to 2 days for it to thaw out. Make sure the turkey's still in the plastic bag though that it came in. You don't have to take it out of the bag. Should thaw in about 1 or 2 days, but remember to still keep it cool. Set it outside. If you're in the fall, winter, set it in the garage where it's cooler. But every morning and every afternoon, right before you go to bed, come out and make sure the water is still cold in there, because you don't want it getting over 40 degrees. That's the magic number for all that food safety stuff.
Do you want the award-winning flavor of the multi-award-winning 4 Legs Up barbecue in your kitchen without hiring the whole crew? Now you can purchase their full line of barbecue rubs and sauces to use during your next cookout. You're going to need a top-of-the-line grill to truly bring out the flavor. Thankfully, 4 Legs Up Barbecue is the official distributor for Louisiana Grills. Go to www.4legsupbbq.com to learn more about their full line of products and grilling classes, and make sure to tune in to Pitmasters to see how 4 Legs Up Barbecue cooks their award-winning dishes.
Now that we've got the basics of that brine down, we can also add some flavor with that brine to give us a little bit more flavor with the meat. Since we're using the brine to add moisture, let's also add some flavor while we're at it. We can add sugars to help balance out the salts, and this could be anything from plain white sugar, brown sugar, honey, molasses, any type of sweetener that you want to use. Spices, whatever floats your turkey boat, go ahead and use. Black pepper is always nice, garlic, onions, bay leaf, pickling spice, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember the old song, whatever you want to use. Even a little bit of chipotle powder. But you know, go easy on that because mom gets to eat on it too. Always make sure you keep it cold. Make sure your brine solution is below 40 degrees before you start the brining process. While brining, keep it in the fridge or keep it in a cooler packed in ice. Or another easy way out is to inject that brine solution again, with the added flavors of course, and put it back in the fridge. That's a whole lot easier way of doing it. In a plastic bag or in a covered pan to keep from dripping. This requires much less space, much less mess. Really, when you go buy meats today, since brining works so well to keep meats moist during cooking, almost all retail outlets of turkey, chicken, a lot of pork cuts are already pre-brined for you. If you look on the package and if you see a statement that says something like enhanced with up to an 8% or a 10%, 15, whatever percent it is, solution, then the product has already been brined for you. You don't have to brine it. It's already got all the salt and the other ingredients in it to keep that bird moist. If your turkey is enhanced, again, you really don't need to do anything but cook it. But then you say, well, I want to add flavors to my meat. How am I going to do that? Well, there's a little bit of the tricky part. Since your meat is already brined, it's going to be a little tougher to get flavors into it, but fear not, we can still get it done. The keys to adding any other flavors that you want to, you're going to need to inject those flavors into that bird. Inject flavor solutions liberally into the meat, again with a syringe. You can use the same one if you're going to inject brine. Then let it rest overnight or a good 8-12 hours before you get around to cooking it. Try some retail pre-made injections. There's some pretty good ones out there on the shelf, or make your own. Just kind of be careful that you're not adding a lot of extra salt, because we've already got salt in that brine that's already in that bird, and just inject liberally. You can search on the internet. There's all kinds of recipes out there for flavor enhancing injections for turkeys, chickens, pork loins, whatever it is you're going to use. Water. Important that we're using good water for our brines. If your tap water is chlorinated at home or has an off taste, something's a little bit odd to it, you know, if you prefer getting drinking water from the store, then I would suggest getting water for your brining from the store as well, because any off taste that you have in your tap water at the house will come through in that cooked product. Here's a little cold brine trick to help you out, to help reduce your prep time. Bring your brine to a boil to help dissolve the salts and the sugars that you've got in it. Get the spices in it that you want to use to get those into solution, and then let everything steep for a couple hours. When you do that, we can help shorten our time by only boiling about half of the liquid that we need. then adding the rest of the liquid that we need as ice. For example, if you're going to make a gallon of brine, boil 1/2 your liquid with the rest of your salt, spices, sugars, whatever you're going to put in it. Let it set, let it steep for an hour or two, or while you're gone for the afternoon, whatever. And then come back and add 4 or 5 pounds of ice. When the ice melts, you'll be about 1/2 gallon of water back into your brine. Because remember the saying that a pint is a pound the world around. That's what that means is 1 pound of ice is going to give you 1 pint or 16 ounces of water. So 4 or 5 pounds of ice is going to give you about 1/2 gallon. That's going to cool that brine down enough to get it down below 40 degrees so you can go ahead and put your turkey back in the brine right away instead of letting it sit in the refrigerator and take a couple days to get down to that 40 degrees. Okay, a basic brine recipe then is, as we talked about, 1 cup of kosher salt to 1 gallon of liquid, or about 2/3 to 3/4 of a cup of table salt to 1 gallon of liquid. Use some sugars to replace about half of the volume of the salt with sugar. In other words, you can cut that 1 cup of kosher salt down to 1/2 cup of kosher salt if you put 1/2 cup to 1 full cup of sugar in with it. Here's one of my favorite brine recipes that I like to use is 2 large cans of Swanson's chicken broth, which ends up being about 10 cups total, 1/2 cup of soy sauce, 1/2 cup of kosher salt, 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of whole black peppercorns, 1/4 cup of pickling spice, 3 bay leaves, 1/3 cup of onion powder, 1/3 cup of garlic powder, and then 1 6-ounce can of frozen orange juice concentrate. This one is a great brine for injecting. If you're going to soak a whole turkey, you're going to have to double, if not triple, that brine recipe to get enough volume to soak that whole turkey in. So there's some brine basics for you. Hope you enjoyed the video. That's all we've got for today.